Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. While we give everyone a moment or two to join, why don't you get in the chat and tell us where you're joining us from so we know. Who do we have with us today? Where are you joining us from? Tell us in the chat. We got Patricia from Milford, Connecticut, and Donna from Milford, Connecticut. Oh boy, let's see if I can pronounce this one. North Constantia, New York. Meridian, Carbondale, Colorado. Sandy Hook, Connecticut. Seabrook Island, South Carolina. Danbury. New York City. Rockaway. Queens. Is there closed caption capability? If our IT person can answer that, we've had that in the past. I don't know if we'll be able to do that, but we'll get our best people on it right now. Islip, Long Island, Massapequa. Hi, my name is Rich Merritt, and I'll be your host today. This webinar is brought to you by the Audubon State Offices of Connecticut and New York, whose mission it is to protect birds in the places we all need, in our forests, on our coasts, and across local communities. Note that this webinar is being recorded and will soon be available on our YouTube and Facebook pages. Questions are welcome in the chat box at any time, and we will have time at the end for Q&A. Today's webinar is about coastal stewardship and the efforts that are being made to make beaches safer for birds. And with us today to present on this topic is Corey Folsom O'Keefe and Shelby Casas. Corey is the Director of Bird Conservation for Audubon, Connecticut. And in this position, she oversees Audubon's coastal stewardship and resilience efforts. Corey leads the Audubon Alliance for Coastal Water Birds, which assists the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection's Wildlife Division with the management of the piping plover and other beach nesting birds. She also oversees the Wildlife Guards program, which educates, mentors, and employs Bridgeport and West Haven High School students as beach nesting bird stewards. And with us is Shelby Casas, the Coastal Program Associate for Audubon, New York, based at the Theodore Roosevelt Sanctuary and Center in Oyster Bay. She oversees the monitoring and stewardship for federal and state shorebirds of concern for Audubon on multiple sites across Long Island. Good afternoon, Corey and Shelby, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us, Rich.
All right.
Shall we go ahead and get started?
Please do. Everyone's anxious to see what you're going to talk about today, so thank you.
Okay. Well, good evening all. Good afternoon all, and thank you for joining us for Audubon Connecticut's monthly webinar. Today's presentation is on the birds that use our coasts, the work that Audubon does to steward these species, and how you can help. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about the National Audubon Society, which Connecticut and New York are a field office of. The National Audubon Society's mission is to protect birds in the places they need today and tomorrow. Through science, advocacy, education, and on-the-ground conservation, we are protecting birds in the places they need throughout their life cycles, on the breeding and wintering grounds, and also at the places that they stop between the two. In addition, our state programs, nature centers, chapters, and partners reach millions of people each year to inform, inspire, and unite diverse communities in conservation action. We believe in a world in which people and wildlife thrive. If we protect the birds, we protect the earth. We will start today's presentation with an overview of the flyways and then focus in on shorebirds and seabirds that use the Atlantic flyway. You'll hear about the threats these birds face and how Audubon and partners are working to reduce threats. We'll conclude with information on how you can help these incredible birds successfully raise their young and reach their destinations. Birds are amazing. They travel the globe as they go between their wintering and breeding grounds, often stopping to rest and refuel along the way. Shorebirds and seabirds have some of the longest migrations of all birds. In fact, 2/3 of shorebird species that breed in North America travel from breeding grounds in the Arctic to wintering grounds in Central and South America. The Arctic tern has one of the longest migrations, between 37 and 50,000 miles a year as it travels between the Arctic and the Antarctic. For shorebirds, spring migration tends to be quick, with adult birds rushing to the breeding grounds in hope of getting the best territory and a mate, while fall migration extends over a larger period and includes a mix of adults and the young of the year. During these journeys, stopover habitat, places with abundant food resources where birds can replenish their energy reserves quickly, are critical. Stopover habitats aren't just on the coast. For example, the Cheyenne Bottoms in central Kansas includes more than 15,000 acres of wetlands. Located at the heart of the Central Flyway, 39 species of shorebirds have been spotted at the bottoms. And for 10 of those species, significant percentages of their populations stayed at Cheyenne Bottoms. To ensure that we have healthy shorebird populations into the future, the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network was launched in 1985. This voluntary network of 114 sites and 434 partners working in 18 countries includes 38.6 million acres. These sites are managed for effective conservation, resulting in healthy shorebird populations and habitats. A number of network sites are within the Atlantic Flyway and include the Altamaha River Delta in Georgia, the Barrier Islands of Maryland and Virginia, the Delaware Bay, Edward B. Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge in New Jersey, Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge, and Great Marsh in Massachusetts, and the Bay of Fundy. At this point, I'm going to pass the mic to Shelby to tell you about some of the bird species that use these sites and other sites along the Atlantic Flyway. Unmute yourself, Shelby.
Good afternoon, everyone. So in partner with local, state, and regional government agencies, Audubon chapters, land managers, and other conservation partners, Audubon, Connecticut, and New York work to protect priority shorebird and seabird species, all of which are either endangered, threatened, or at risk during their nesting and migratory journey. A few of the species we're going to cover today are the piping plover, the American oystercatcher, and the least tern. These beach nesting birds nest on sandy beaches and islands across New York and Connecticut, the beaches where they have habitat to nest, and the water is where they have their food. The piping plover, like many of these species, is a migratory bird spending its winters in the Southern Hemisphere, including areas like the Bahamas. During the spring, they migrate north to their breeding habitat, which includes Connecticut and New York. These birds use this time to establish territories, find mates, and start their limited breeding season. Piping plovers are territorial nesters and will defend their nesting area, mate chicks, if a new plover enters territory during the nesting season. They lay around 3 to 4 eggs in a shallow depression called a scrape.
We seem to have some technological issues here, Shelby. I think it looks like you're back. I think I just saw your screen move, but we lost everything from when you said the nest is called a scrape.
So sorry about that. So the nest is called a scrape. You can see an example of that in the top right corner. These nests are well camouflaged to hide them from predators. The pair will incubate these eggs for about a month. Once the chicks hatch, they are precocial birds, which means within hours of hatching, these chicks will follow their parents to food sources and forage for their own food. Adults will spend the next month with the chicks, protecting them from a wide range of predators and threats until they are able to fly and head down south for their wintering season. Additionally, American oystercatchers follow a similar breeding schedule as piping plovers, migrating north in mid-March to early April, establishing territories and finding mates. American oystercatchers are also territorial nesters, performing vocal territorial displays with other American oystercatcher adults and pairs that encroach on their territory during this time. American oystercatchers nest in a variety of coastal habitats, including sandy and rocky beaches, marsh, shell, and rocky islands, and have even nested on gravel rooftops in North Carolina and Florida. They lay around 2 to 3 eggs in late April to early May, and will attempt to renest like many of these shorebirds if their initial nest fails. American oystercatcher chicks are also precocial which allows them to forage within hours of hatching. The chicks will stay with the adult well after fledging, which means they can fly, and often join the staging groups in August and September, where they'll spend with large numbers of other American oystercatcher groups before they head to their wintering grounds, which include New Jersey all the way south to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, the last breeding bird that we are going to cover is the least tern. They arrive in the nesting habitat around mid-May to early June, where they establish large groups of nesting pairs called a colony. This colony nesting habitat provides protection for not only the tern colony, but also nearby nesting shorebirds like the piping plover and the American oystercatcher. They nest near bodies of water, including sandy and shelly beaches and islands. Each pair lays around 1 to 2 eggs in a nest, and they forage on small fish in nearby areas, including sand lace and menhaden. Generally, least terns return each year to past nest sites, but changes in nearby prey, available nearby human activity, substrate conditions can prompt them to make a move to a different site. Tern chicks are semi-precocial, unlike the American oystercatcher and the piping plover. So when they hatch, even though they hatch well developed, they do rely on their parents for food, and often these chicks will seek food from their parents well after leaving the nest and once they're fledged. In the bottom right corner, you can see a well-fledged least tern chick still seeking food from their parents.
One other species we want to mention is the semi-palmated sandpiper. This robin-sized shorebird doesn't nest in the United States, but our shores and wetlands along the flyway are vital to this species during migration. In spring, huge numbers stop in the Delaware Bay to forage alongside red knots and horseshoe crab eggs. And during fall migration, if I can get this, oh, I missed it. If I get this video to play, I'm having trouble getting the video to play, so it is what it is. Oh, here we go. Oh. There we go. During fall migration, bird watchers will find large groups at many locations along the Atlantic coast. For example, Connecticut has 3 globally important bird areas for semi-palmated sandpiper, where thousands of individuals can be seen from late July to early August. This is a video from Stratford Point, which is located at the mouth of the Housatonic River. And you can see all the semi-palmated sandpipers, as well as some ruddy turnstones and dudlands actively foraging along the shoreline at a sort of mid-tide and rising. Okay, Shelby, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk about the threats that some of these birds face.
So piping plovers were actually driven to near extinction around the turn of the century by extensive hunting for meat, sport, and for the millinery industry. With the passing of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1918, piping plovers began to recover by the mid-1920s. The population peaked around the 40s, but declined once again due to development and recreation following World War II. So continued human pressure, such as coastal development, recreational activities, and disturbance by off-road vehicles have reduced the available suitable breeding habitat for both the piping plovers and other shorebirds. In 1986, the piping plover was listed as threatened and endangered on the Endangered Species Act. Currently, beach nesting birds face many threats, including sea level rise, habitat loss, and predation from non and native predators. With increasing damage to coastal areas by storms and flooding on the rise, shorebirds can lose nesting habitat both before and during the nesting season. Often nesting areas can flood during the breeding season, leading to a loss of a nest. In the bottom right picture, you can see a flooded nesting area on Long Island, which includes a piping plover nest exclosure. Loss of nest during the breeding season can cause a pair to restart their nest later in the season during the hotter months, when they do lead to more heat exposure to the eggs. Additionally, these birds need to evade a variety of predators, both avian and mammal. Predators can eat eggs or young chicks, and often these predators hunt at night like foxes and can only be identified as the predator that caused the nest failure through tracks or through predator cameras set up at nesting sites. Human disturbance poses a major threat to both beach nesting and migratory shorebirds. Beach recreationists and cars can crush eggs and scare predators off a nest, exposing eggs to the sun and extreme temperatures, also to nearby predators, and interrupt foraging and roosting. Trash left at a nest site or washed up can entangle birds or can be ingested. Trash attracts predators like crows and raccoons, leading them to nearby nests. Additionally, dogs, especially off-leash dogs, can scare birds and accidentally injure unfledged chicks, as well as exhaust migratory shorebirds at their limited resting stopovers.
Each year, Audubon partners and many volunteers work to reduce threats to shorebirds and seabirds through habitat management, outreach and education, and monitoring and research. At nest sites, a number of strategies are used to reduce disturbance. For example, symbolic string fencing and signs alert visitors to nesting areas, and exclosures prevent larger predators from accessing eggs. Habitat can also be enhanced. A simple way to improve habitat for seabirds is to build tern shelters. Audubon, New York, and partners from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Audubon chapters, and the town of Brookhaven annually make shelters for least common and roseate terns. Sometimes habitat needs more intense restoration. Beach nesting birds are often leery of vegetation, which can conceal predators. Strong storms like hurricanes and nor'easters can prevent vegetation from being established, but sometimes it is necessary for humans to lend a helping hand. A multi-phase restoration project at Barnegat Light enhanced habitat for both nesting and migratory shorebirds and seabirds by removing vegetation, creating high-quality foraging habitat in the form of a shallow pond, and fenced the habitat post-restoration. This project wouldn't have been successful without a strong partnership supporting it. And this is something that is true at many sites where shorebirds and seabirds are nesting. Partnership is key. Management ensures that birds have protected, healthy habitats to nest and rest, but we also need to make sure that visitors to these sites are aware of the birds and the little things that they can do to help. Our outreach and education programs reach visitors of all ages, and through these programs, we strive to provide a ladder to careers in conservation for students of all backgrounds.
On Long Island Sound, the TR Audubon Center educators visit local elementary schools and teach students about coastal ecology, how to identify their local beach nesting bird species, and threats those birds face. After lessons, these kids work with their teachers to design, share the shore signs with their own messaging and artwork. A few of these designs are made into weather-resistant signs that get posted on local beaches with our regulatory government signs. As Audubon thrives to continue to engage youth in volunteer work and job opportunities, Audubon Connecticut established the Wildlife Guard program in 2012 to employ local high school students and college-age crew leaders from West Haven and the Bridgeport area. These students serve as official monitors tasked with tracking the reproductive success of state-threatened birds sharing their knowledge and engaging the public in protection of the Long Island Sound. On Long Island, Audubon runs the Be a Good Egg outreach program with volunteers, Audubon chapters, and local partners. The goal is to reduce human disturbance threats through educating beachgoers and encouraging people to sign the Be a Good Egg pledge to share the shore with shorebirds and seabirds. From June to August, Be a Good Egg tables are set up at priority nesting sites across Long Island Sound, asking guests to sign the Be a Good Egg pledge to respect fenced off areas, keep beaches clean, and carry out trash, and keep dogs off nesting beaches or leashed.
The last component of our coastal stewardship work is monitoring and research. Monitoring is required to understand if we are achieving recovery plan goals for threatened species. For example, the piping plover Atlantic coast population revised recovery plan calls for 2,000 pairs along the East Coast and a 5-year average productivity of 1.5 pledged chicks per pair. Each state along the flyway has a pair number goal, and a lot of work goes into reaching that productivity goal every year. Research also helps us better understand the needs of bird species that we are working to protect. In Connecticut, we have an oystercatcher banding program and have been working to band our oystercatcher population since 2018. Through banding, we are learning more about the wintering locations of oystercatchers that nest in Connecticut, staging areas that they use prior to the breeding season and post-breeding season, survival and lifetime productivity, and also mate and site fidelity. In Connecticut, we definitely have birds that have switched mates and also birds that have switched nesting sites. And in Connecticut, there's actually a threesome oystercatcher group that is pretty interesting to study.
In 2018, Audubon New York and Connecticut partnered with Virginia Tech and groups along the Atlantic Flyway in a shorebird disturbance survey project. From 2018 to 2020, staff conducted surveys assessing types of disturbance, frequency, and shorebird behavior from March to October, covering their nesting and migratory season. In 2021, both Connecticut and New York joined the phase 3 of this project to implement management strategies to reduce specific disturbance types researched in phase 1, which include dog walkers and promoting beachgoers to giving birds space. Now, how can you help? One of our greatest ways that we work to promoting shorebird success is getting people involved, educating people in the shorebirds and attending presentations like this. So step 1, we always ask people to be a good egg, whether that's taking the pledge, but also just remembering our share the shore messaging, which Corey's going to cover a little bit more. During the breeding season, which is right now, we ask people to respect that fencing area and enclosures, keep pets off of nesting beaches, or to check dog rules for beaches you're visiting, and observe the tide when you're visiting your local beaches. And then the last step is always, if you can, to volunteer to locate a Audubon chapter or conservation group near you. And you've already done one of these steps, attend the shorebird presentation.
So for the last few minutes of the presentation, we just want to give you some tips for visiting the beaches this summer, particularly if you are visiting beaches that have nesting bird populations. So there are good times to visit the beach, and there are maybe not so good times to visit the beach. For example, in Connecticut and New York, our piping plovers and oystercatchers arrive in March, and they're sort of setting up their nesting territories, laying their eggs, incubating their eggs from the period of March to early May. And then later on in the season, September and October, our piping plovers and oystercatchers are they've fledged their young, they're moving around. Plovers might already be back in the Bahamas, but we have migratory shorebirds coming in. I mentioned earlier that the the fall migration period is, roughly from the end of June through December. So you can see a nice variety of shorebirds on the beach in September and October. And those two periods, March to early May and September to October, are really good times to visit the beach. You can go to the beach, see some of these birds, and know that you're sort of causing minimal disturbance. From mid-July through August, at this point, at least in New York and Connecticut, a good number of our chicks, have already fledged. And there are a lot of shorebirds that are passing through. And as long as you are careful to give those birds enough space, chicks that haven't fledged yet, or large groups of migratory shorebirds, this is an okay time to visit the beach. If you are going to a beach that has nesting birds, if you can, we ask that you avoid visiting the beach from mid-May to mid-June. This is really the most sensitive time for our beach nesting birds. So right now, all of our beaches in Connecticut have very young chicks at this point. If the chicks get separated from their parents, they're more likely to get predated or have impacts from the weather. So it's a really stressful time for the birds. And so if you can hold off going to the beach until a little bit later this season, that would definitely be better for the birds. You can also take into account the tide when you're visiting the beach. So low tide is definitely the best time to go. At low tide, there is, the birds that are sort of up in sort of stringed fenced areas, you have plenty of space to avoid those areas. And if there are birds that are sort of foraging in the wet sand, there's plenty of space for you to sort of walk around them as well. So if you can, try to visit beaches, especially narrow barrier beaches at low tide. That's when it really is possible to share the shore. If you go at mid-tide, we ask that you stick to the wet sand. There's still plenty of space to sort of avoid the fenced-in nesting areas. And if you stick to the wet sand and make a point of walking around flocks, this can still be a good time to sort of visit the beach. We ask that you try to avoid visiting the beach at high tide. You can sort of see from this image here that at high tide, there's typically very little space between the fenced off nesting area where the birds are nesting and the water line. So unless you're willing to get your feet wet, this is a time that it's best to sort of just give the birds the space that they need to care for their young and to rest. And if you're wondering how much space you should give the birds, we recommend at least 100 feet of space. And if you're like me, sometimes it's hard to judge, like, what is 100 feet? It's taken many years of doing bird surveys to figure out what is 100 feet just visually. But to give you an idea, that's 16 beach towels, or 20 dog leashes, or 6 kayaks. So those are just some examples of what 100 feet is. And if you can give, birds with nestlings, birds with nests, or good sized flocks of shorebirds 100 feet, it will give them the space that they need to raise their young and rest and refuel before they continue their migrations. And with that, we want to thank you for joining us for today's presentation. We are thrilled to have the opportunity to tell you about the birds that use the Atlantic Flyway and all the things that you guys can do to help them out this season and beyond. So thank you very much. And we're glad to answer questions now.
Yeah, well, thank you, Corey and Shelby, very much for that. That was a wonderful presentation. We'll be opening up for question and answers in just a few moments. So if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can with the time we have left. And joining us right now to assist with the Q&A portion of our program are Beth Amendola, Audubon's Coastal Program Coordinator, and Natalie Albrecht, Audubon's Coastal Waterbird Technician. Welcome, Beth and Natalie. Beth, since you popped up first, why don't you kick off the Q&A to our hosts?
Great, thank you, Rich. So Corey, I'll pose this great question that came up in the chat to you. Patricia H asked about fireworks along the coastline, specifically in Connecticut. However, fireworks do impact a lot of our shorebirds. And her question is, what should citizens of coastal communities know about potential threats of fireworks and the threats that these present to birds?
Okay, well, Patricia, that is a great question. And fireworks are a challenge to our beach nesting birds. If fireworks are, set off in the vicinity of beach nesting birds, there's a few things that can happen. If they're set off really right within the nesting area, that can, cause, say a colony of birds like least terns to potentially abandon that area and move on to a different area. We in Connecticut, we actually, sort of close nesting areas typically during firework events. So, in the past, the town of West Haven or the town of Stratford have had firework events, and the nearby nesting areas so a nesting area in West Haven, and then also a nesting area in Milford that's close to where the Stratford fireworks go off. Those areas are closed. In another spot in Stratford, if there are nesting birds there are folks on hand to make sure that people do not enter that section of that park during the nesting season or during the fireworks display. We really want to, we ask people to give the birds, 100 feet of space, but during fireworks, when, there's all these loud bangs and noises, if we can actually just completely stay out of the nesting areas, then that's sort of the way we can keep the birds as sort of as calm as possible during an event. Typically, we are a lot of times we are looking for volunteers too during firework events to sort of just help us sort of be stationed on the perimeter of those nesting areas, and just, asking people, hey, if you guys can head down the beach to this other area, this area is closed tonight just because we have all these birds here, but, please feel free to head down the beach and enjoy the fireworks in other locations. So, definitely, I don't know that we need volunteers this year for fireworks, but certainly in future years, it might be something we're looking for people to help us out with.
That's great. Thank you, Corey. Patricia just made another comment in there. And unfortunately, most of the fireworks displays that are cause more disturbance to the birds are the unsanctioned ones. So folks, everybody likes to go off and set up their own fireworks. And unfortunately, would be a matter for law enforcement to deal with if that is something going on in your area.
And then we had another question from Mercedes G. And she asked, generally, what are the rules, if there are any, regarding drone usages near nesting areas or in the flyway?
So I'll take that question. One of the important things that any drone user really should know is that there are no drone, like no fly spaces, especially in Connecticut that border a lot of airports. But overall, most nesting habitats do say no drones. It really does, though, depend on each beach area. But it is preferred that drone users do not fly over nesting colonies. Birds can interact with them. It can lead to injuries. Drones can crash and unfortunately end up in colonies, which can also injure birds, both the adults and chicks. So it is preferable to not fly drones over nesting beaches.
Thanks. I got a question then. The exclosures that Shelby, both you and Corey had described briefly. I think Shelby, you showed one that had been flooded out. Are those exclosures, are they there, permanently, and then birds find them to nest under, or are they set up over nests on an annual basis? And what exactly are those things, I guess, is the question. I guess I'm asking Shelby, but Corey, feel free to answer that as well.
So piping plover exclosures, and the exclosure structure is only used for piping plover nests. It's usually made out of chicken wire. They are put right over a full piping plover nest, so about 4 eggs. They are placed as soon as the nest has a full clutch, and they do stay for the remainder of the season, mostly due to the fact that least terns and other colony nesters do tend to nest around in those same areas, so as to not disturb nesting least terns or common terns. We do leave those exclosures in place until the birds leave. But once those piping plover chicks hatch, They don't tend to see the exposure as like a home base. They do kind of work or like walk around the beach and don't really use it like as added protection. And I do want to note those exposures are put up by trained staff. And so it is something that usually both Audubon Connecticut staff or Audubon New York staff or the land manager who oversees shorebirds would be the ones who would put those exposures in.
So Corey, there's another really good question in the chat here about really, is there anything that folks can do to help keep fish crows away from chicks?
That is a good question. You know, fish crows are corvids are some of the smarter avian predators, and you know, definitely we have occasionally noticed that they will sort of pick up on the fact that if there's an exposure, that eventually there might be a chick that emerges from that exposure. I think one of the things that Audubon will do is if we notice this association between, or Audubon and partners, if we notice this association between chicks and the exposures, we will actually stop putting exposures around the nests so that there isn't like this, you know, big chicken wire fence sort of marking, hey, there's a nest here. But for the public, I would say that, you know, just not leaving trash on the beach. Anything we can do to reduce, you know, the sort of, you know, trash can basically attract things like fish crows and other predators, you know, like seagulls, you know, mammals like foxes, raccoons, opossums. It will attract them to beaches. So if we can be, you know, very conscious of carrying in and carrying out, you know, if you're coming to the beach, if you bring a sandwich, bring a trash bag so you can bring it back out, and ideally take the trash bag home with you too. You know, sometimes a lot of municipalities will have, you know, trash containers at their beach, but maybe they're only getting, you know, emptied once a week. So sometimes they're overflowing. And so really a carry in, carry out trash policy is really helpful for reducing the number of fish crows and other predators that are attracted to beaches.
And Shelby, I have a question from Nick K, and he asked, is movement or noise more disruptive to birds, or is there a certain disturbance that's more disturbing? Yeah.
So we would say definitely in like coming close to shorebirds is going to cause a large disturbance. Not only does it cause them to be on alert, but if these are adults that are brooding chicks, they will use their energy to lead predators or lead people away from those chicks or nests. That's using a lot of their energy. It then also leaves that nest and those chicks open to predation, leaves those chicks open to, or it leaves those eggs open to, you know, the elements. And so that is a big disturbance factor. When it comes to noise, I'm assuming they're like referring to fireworks, car horns. We do see that sometimes as it can affect birds, but it's definitely more of that encroaching on their space. We definitely want to give them that 100 feet of space when possible. We want to stay out of that fencing. And we also want to keep dogs and things away that might chase shorebirds while they're roosting. And
Thanks, Shelby. Corey, I got a question for you. Some people want to know about that throuple of oyster catchers there in Connecticut. Is it two males and a female, or the other way? And do all three of the birds take care of the nest?
That's a question for Shelby, actually. It's on Lido Beach in New York where that's taking place.
Yeah, so that's actually one of the great things about the banding of oyster catchers. It does allow land managers and Audubon to observe the different behaviors of nesting American oyster catchers. And over the year, they did find out that there is a throuple on Lido Beach on the south shore of Long Island. It is one male and two female American oyster catchers that have two nests. So yeah. And they'll just learn more from this American oyster catcher group.
So So I also just want to bring up another question. Someone was mentioning that they noticed on some areas that vehicles are allowed to park right up along the fencing. In Connecticut, we don't allow any driving on our beaches, but Shelby, I guess we'll pose this one to you, because in some places, New York, they can still drive on beaches. What kind of threat does that cause to our fresh little hatchlings?
So yes, so in New York, both government officials on certain beaches, land managers do have ability to drive. Also out on the east end of Long Island, there are sites where people are still allowed to recreationally drive out on the beach. Land managers do take precautions. Any driver is usually educated. They have a top speed that they're required to do. If chicks are in the area, they are educated on that. In some cases, stewards do have to walk with vehicles depending on the type of vehicle. If an unknown driver is coming on due to maybe like a medical emergency or something like that, that driver would then be escorted by a steward. It does, unfortunately, as we mentioned in the presentation, vehicles can be a risk to our piping plovers and multiple shorebirds. One of the things that people don't realize is that those really deep tire tracks can lead a ditch that a chick can fall into. So that it can leave them stranded and unable to climb out of. One of those things is that if you do, along with that, if you do see like a hole in the sand, like a very big ditch that somebody like dug out, it's good to fill in that on a nesting beach because a shorebird could fall into it and could lead to a death.
And Corey, I'll pose this question to you. So Dorothy commented, and she was referring to Harkness, a park in Connecticut where we have a handful of birds. And she's noticed frequently there are people not following signage, entering into areas they're not supposed to be in, launching kayaks in places they're not supposed to be, and was just wondering what are the best ways to handle a situation if you're at a breeding site and you're seeing something like this happening and maybe there's not a staff or a tech that's visible or out.
I think, there is, if you see something that it doesn't look good, we do have volunteers that work on our beaches, and we do ask them to, if they see somebody that's in an area that's closed or inside the string of fights fencing, we do ask them to engage that person and tell them, why, why they shouldn't be in that area, point out that, some birds to them and sort of explain that, these, in Connecticut, we've just got 60 pairs of piping plovers. It's a really small number of birds, and we really need to do all we can to give them the space to be able to sort of raise their young. That said, at the same time, we don't want people to be in an uncomfortable situation. So if you talk to somebody and they're, kind of don't respond well to it, walk away. And, at that point, go try to find somebody who's on park staff, or you can call local environmental conservation officers as well, and let them know that, you see people that are in an area that they shouldn't be in. And even just reporting that goes a long way. They may not be able to get there during the time period that somebody's in that closed off area, but they are aware of it. It's getting recorded. And if there's a particular beach and they're getting a lot of calls about people that are going into this area that's closed, to protect the birds, they're going to start to spend more time at that location because they know that it is a problem. From a staff perspective, if we see, things that are happening that, are not good, we definitely keep a log. We collect a lot of information on sort of what we're seeing in a report format so that we, can reach out to the environmental conservation officers. And then we also can provide the data that sort of shows what's happening at that site so that they can then take action and respond.
Thanks, Corey. Shelby, I had a question for you. People want to know how they can pledge to be a good egg. Everybody wants to be a good egg, of course, but you showed a picture, looked like someone was actually signing something. How can one make this pledge? You're on mute.
So we do have a website that you can go to sign the Be a Good Egg pledge online. In our PowerPoint, we additionally added a QR code that we implemented in 2021 as a social distancing measure. So people can scan that QR code. It does take them directly to the Be a Good Egg pledge. But we can also drop the Be a Good Egg pledge in the chat. Like magic. So yeah, so signing that is a really great way. And then that is the pledge that we do ask people to sign when we are doing our Be a Good Egg outreach.
So Corey, there've been a couple questions about piping plover and American oyster catcher behavior after hatching. So one was referring to oyster catchers. After they hatch, do the chicks and the adults stay near the nesting area? And the other was in regards to piping plovers as well. After they hatch, do they stay in the nesting area? And is that why we keep our string fencing up almost till migration?
Those are good questions. So after the nest hatch, the piping plover chicks and the oyster catcher chicks are fairly mobile. Maybe for the first 6 hours, they might sort of stay near the nesting area. Sometimes the chicks don't all hatch at the same time. So the first chick might have hatched and sort of just curled up next to mom while she continues to incubate the remaining eggs. But then once they are all mobile, they will move around. Now, we keep the fencing up because that is kind of this safe area that they can go, but they do need to leave that string fenced area periodically to forage. Shelby mentioned that, birds find their food from, down by the water. So the plovers and the oyster catchers, parents and adults, parents and chicks will make their way down to the water to forage. So if you are, even though the fenced area is sort of the fenced area where you expect them to be, it's, if you're walking along a beach that has nesting birds, it's good to keep an eye out for them, even outside of the fenced in areas, because they might have these chicks with their parents occasionally making trips down to the water line to forage for crustaceans and insects. So they are pretty mobile. They can move around quite a lot. A lot of the times, if it's a really hot day, you might actually see the chicks hanging out underneath what little bits of vegetation there are on the beach. So it's kind of a good thing that they can move there. It is sort of means that they can move away from predators. They can move away from stressful situations. But it also means that they are not always in the string fence area. They may be outside of the string fence area, and that's something to just be very mindful of.
Thank you. We're only going to have time for about one more question. We have a very curious group today too, and there's going to be a lot of questions we haven't gotten to, especially about site-specific stuff, particular beaches, and we can follow up on that. I'll drop in the chat the email addresses you can send your question to, and we'll have one of these experts get back to you if you have a burning question we haven't gotten to. But we have time for one more question then. Natalie, you want to pitch that?
Yeah. So there were a couple questions, and I know Shelby and Corey kind of touched on this here and there, but about specific questions about how to get involved with actual on the ground monitoring, specifically in Connecticut and New York, respectively.
Okay. Well, in Connecticut, if you're interested in getting more involved, and by more involved, I would say, volunteering to be a beach nesting bird monitor. So there's things you could do this season, and then there's more that you could do next season. So, right now we're not taking any more volunteers. We have 170 people who have volunteered to help us out this season, and we're thrilled with that 170 people. But we started our training back in March, so it is kind of like late at this point to have additional volunteers join. That said, we will definitely be looking for help taking down the string fencing at the end of the summer. So if you're interested in helping with that, you can email our volunteer coordinator at ctwaterbirds@gmail.com. Beth, if you want to throw that in the chat, that would be great so people have it. And then also, if you're interested in volunteering next year, same email address, just let our volunteer coordinator know to add you to the list, and he'll get you on the list for next year.
And then in New York, we do not volunteers don't do shorebird monitoring, but we do do our outreach program, which includes our Be a Good Egg beach cleanup and our turn shelter building. So right now, we actually just kicked off our outreach programs for the summer on June 4th with our Share the Shore Day, which includes, which our volunteers help with doing bird walks, the Be a Good Egg table, and multiple other events. Right now, we are still looking for volunteers for our Be a Good Egg events, which we can send after this webinar, because there are quite a few days ranging right now from June all the way until August of Be a Good Egg events that we do in Oyster Bay, on the South Shore at Jones Beach and Lido, at West Meadow, and at Sunken Meadow.
Thanks, Shelby. Well, that's all the time that we have today. So all the registrants today will be receiving an email in the next couple of days with a recording of this, as well as all of the many links to how to sign the pledge and other links to the programs in case they want to get more involved or learn more. But thank you for joining us today, and thanks to Corey and to Shelby and to Natalie and Beth. Thank you very much. And our next webinar is scheduled for August 17th and will feature BBC host Patrick Airy, who will present to us some biomimicry and how animals, and especially birds, inspire human ingenuity. Thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.